After the launch of the first 2 trial decks and the very first booster box, Descent of the King of Knights, the second booster set was released on March 10th, 2012, called Onslaught of Dragon Souls. The box art for this set featured Blazing Flare Dragon from Kagura, along with Kai, who was Aichi's rival in the anime. This made the set feel like a counterpart to the first set, which featured Aichi and Alfred from Royal Paladins. While Kagura received a great amount of support this set, it ironically also gave Royal Paladins a card so powerful that it remained in their decks for many sets to come. This set also eventually led to the first ever ban list in Cardfight Vanguard. But if you weren't around to experience this back then, don't worry, I've got your back. And if you need to get your cards for the upcoming set, please check out Saga Concepts. You can use the link in the description below to help yourself and help the channel out. Well, we went over some of the basics of the game in the last video, and if you missed that, you can go ahead and check out the link in the description down below to catch up. There was quite a bit I omitted. For example, I've talked about cards requiring a player to pay a cost, but I never really elaborated on what that meant. Since it don't matter a lot for this set, let's go over 2 common mechanics for paying costs: Soul Blast and Counterblast. Let's start off with Counterblast. When it's your opponent's turn and your Vanguard is hit with an attack, you put the top card or cards of your deck into your damage zone. This is how you keep track of how much damage you have throughout the game. Once 6 cards fill up the zone, it's game over. However, the damage zone has another purpose, as it's part of one of the most amazing mechanics in Vanguard, Counterblast. In modern Vanguard, you can tell when a card's ability is asking you to pay the Counterblast cost when you see this symbol, but it looked a lot more like this in the past. In order to pay the cost of an ability that requires Counterblast, you actually have to physically take 1 or more of the cards in your damage zone and flip them face down. You can only do this if you have cards that are flipped up, so if you have no damage or just used up all of your Counterblast so far, then you cannot pay the cost. This creates a situation where you and your opponent have to weigh risk and rewards. The more damage your opponent gives you, the more Counterblast you'll have. Likewise, the more attacks you guard, the less Counterblast you'll have in your upcoming turn. Next, let's talk about Soul Blast. If you ever wondered what the board in a game of Vanguard looks like, here's your side of the field. This circle here is for your Vanguard. When you ride your next Vanguard, what do you think happens to the previous one? Well, it actually becomes part of your soul stack and stays under your Vanguard. Any cards stacked under your Vanguard are treated as your soul. To pay the cost of a Soul Blast, you simply need to choose any cards from your soul and put them into your drop. You can gain more soul whenever you ride, or you can also gain soul through abilities, such as the superior ride enablers Lu and Dragon Knight Elf that we talked about last time, as their cost was to Counterblast 1 and put cards from the field into your soul. In the modern era, this is what a Soul Blast looks like, whereas in the past, it looked like this. I wanted to take some time in this video just to mainly point out the difference in the icons, because there's a lot of card text in old Vanguard cards which is extremely confusing compared to modern day cards, especially considering these symbols. Basically, for Soul Blast, you're supposed to see that the V means Vanguard and you're supposed to remove the cards under your Vanguard to Soul Blast. Whereas for Counterblast, you're supposed to just notice that you're supposed to turn a card that is light colored into dark colored. We'll talk a bit more about the actual card text structure in a future video. Now that we have a better grasp on how Soul and Counterblast are accumulated, it really puts into perspective how much of a massive cost Mega Blast was. Mega Blast was an ability introduced in the previous set, which required you to Soul Blast 8 and Counterblast 5. Or, in other words, you needed to have 5 out of the 6 damage available to Counterblast. And you needed to have 8 cards in your soul to pay this cost, which is why it was a massive cost that could only really be paid very late in the game. You don't see these types of massive costs that often in modern Vanguard, but back then the game put more value on a player controlling and accumulating these resources for big payouts. On March 10th, 2012, we finally received the very second Cardfight Vanguard booster set in English, titled Onslaught of Dragon Souls. This set provided support for all of the clans from set 1, except for Dark Irregulars and Nubatama, who didn't get a single card this set. It also introduced 2 brand new clans, Great Nature and Bermuda Triangle. However, much like in the previous set, these new clans were only merely introduced here, and didn't have much support. They only received 4 cards each. In this image, it might seem like there were actually 6 cards for Bermuda Triangle, but these 2 are actually special parallels of these 2 cards. Special Parallel, or SP for short, is a higher rarity version of another card, usually in the same set. Can you tell the difference between these 2 cards? Until very later in Vanguard's history, the only difference between SPs and the original versions was the flavor text, or maybe the art was slightly zoomed out instead of a full art or alternate design. This would not change for some time. Spike Brothers and Granblue finally got a huge wave of support, which included both of them finally getting their own trigger unit, a Mega Blast card, and a PG. Spike Brothers also received an attack extender in Dudley Dan, and a main Vanguard in General Siegfried, while Granblue managed to nab themselves a superior ride that they could ride from their drop. Tachikaze and Mega Colony, on the other hand, received minimal support, only getting 4 cards again and no triggers of their own. The main 4 clans, Warrior Paladin, Kagero, Nova Grappler, and Oracle Think Tank, all received a good amount of support. I'll go into it in more detail about their decks, but I wanted to first talk about key cards they received this set. For Oracle Think Tank, a key card in the set was Silent Tom, which finally gave the deck a win condition through one of Vanguard's most decisive mechanics, Guard Restrict. Silent Tom had an ability that stated, if you have an Oracle Think Tank Vanguard, your opponent cannot guard this unit's attacks with grade 0 units. When a player is being attacked, they can guard with units that have shield value and add those units' shield value to their unit's attack for that battle. Cards all have different shield values, but triggers, which are grade 0s, typically had the highest shield values for guarding, which made them everyone's go-to card to guard with. Silent Tom gave Oracle Think Tank a way to be more offensive, since their main Vanguard, CEO Amaterasu, really didn't do much other than draw cards, so the Guard Restrict helped increase the chances of attacks breaking through. Bushiroad seemed to really like superior rides early on, as they gave Kagero yet another one in this set that was featured in the cover art, Blazing Flare Dragon. Blazing Flare Dragon can be ridden similar to the embodiment of Victory Alpha, in that you need to ride a specific grade 2, Blazing Core Dragon, have a grade 1, Iron Tail Dragon, and a grade 0, Gatling Claw Dragon on the field. Then after paying the cost of Counterblast 1 and putting the grade 1 and grade 0 into your soul, you could superior ride Blazing Flare Dragon from your deck. Blazing Flare had 2 powerful abilities, one that allowed you to Soul Blast 5 to retire one of your opponent's rearguards. The other allowed this unit to gain power if an opponent's rearguard was retired. These 2 abilities naturally worked well together, but also was easy to achieve as you already had 2 extra cards in your soul from superior riding. Royal Paladin received a similar card that had overall better synergy with its support called Soul Saver Dragon, which was a grade 3 that wasn't a superior ride, but had 2 strong abilities. The first effect boosted its power each time it attacked the Vanguard. The second effect allowed it to Soul Blast 5 when it was placed as the Vanguard to give 3 of your rearguards power. What made Soul Saver Dragon better than Blazing Flare Dragon was that it was more consistent thanks to Pongal. Pongal allows you to Counterblast 1 and put itself into Soul to add a Soul Saver Dragon directly from your deck and put it into your hand. This meant you didn't really have to worry about drawing into it. Also, that extra power it gave to the rearguards was extremely powerful, but I'll dive deeper into that in a moment. The last thing I'll highlight from this set are the Special Intercepts. These were grade 2 units that each of the 4 main clans, as well as Spike Bros and Granblue, received. They all had the same effect, where if you had a unit from the same clan as it as your Vanguard and intercepted with it, you gained extra shield. Intercept is an ability exclusive to grade 2s. If a grade 2 unit is in your front row, rearguard circle, then it can be used to guard your Vanguard or your other units from an attack, as long as that unit was not the one being attacked. This boost to its shield value was pretty massive, as it gave you enough shield to be on par with trigger units. With PGs being the main defensive cards that we had at the time, these special intercepts allowed players to go on the offensive and still protect themselves the following turn. But now, I think it's about time we talk about the power standards in Vanguard to give you a better idea on how strong special intercepts can be, but also to put into perspective how strong Soul Saver Dragon was. Vanguard handles attack and shield values in a simple but rather interesting way. Most card games deal with power creep, which is the continuous escalation of power values and mechanics throughout a game's lifespan. This is done to continuously engage players, but also require players to continuously buy cards, as your older cards would be weaker compared to the new ones. Typically, this takes the form of numbers like attack or health getting bigger over time. Vanguard instead decided that all cards have set rules they follow for their values, depending on their grade. All grade 1s generally have 7,000 attack, grade 2s have 9,000 attack, and grade 3s range from 10 to 11,000, but it eventually settled at 11,000 for the majority of the cases. Units without abilities would gain extra attack, 8,000 for grade 1s, 10,000 for grade 2s. However, if they had powerful abilities instead, they would have less attack, such as Dudley Dan having a measly 4,000 attack for grade 1, but in exchange allowed the user to call out a card from their deck. Another example were the special intercepts we just talked about, which were actually grade 2s with 8,000 attack instead of 9,000 in exchange for their extra shield. While this is pretty standard fare for pretty much every TCG, where the things with the bigger numbers usually have some sort of downfall, being that they have no effect or some sort of drawback, and the things that have the lower number tend to have the stronger effects, these rules and power standards remained in effect for the entirety of this run of Vanguard. I really wanted to take some time to paint these values clearly to show the power of Soul Saver Dragon in this early stage of the game. So, on your first grade 3 turn, you'd swing in with your grade 3 Vanguard, which typically had 10,000 power or 11,000 power. With a grade 1 boosting it, you might reach 16,000 attack. If you went first in this scenario, your opponent was still in grade 2, with a 9,000 attack Vanguard. So they need at least 8,000 shield to reach 17,000 to stop your attack. However, the opposing player also has to consider your possible trigger checks. Since you're on grade 3, you had up to 2 of them, each possibly adding 5,000 power, meaning your opponent has to compensate for you reaching a maximum of 26,000 attack, compared to the 10 or 11,000 they started off with this turn. The player being attacked has a few options here. They can choose not to guard, they could guard with 1 or 2 cards and hope for no triggers, or guard with 2 to 4 cards in the case that you do hit triggers. You might see now in this example why special intercepts are so important in this stage of the game, as they allowed you to guard for 19,000 total and not require you to use any of the resources in your hand, at the cost of losing an attacker you already had on board. Since attack values and shield values are closely balanced at this point, every card is an important resource for guarding, or for getting just enough power to make your attacks difficult to guard. But then we have Soul Saver Dragon. Using the same example as before, Soul Saver Dragon starts out with 10,000 power. When it attacks the Vanguard, it gets an extra 3,000. With a unit boosting it, it can hit an impressive 20,000. Its second skill, when you ride Soul Saver, allows you to Soul Blast 5, give 3 of your rearguards an extra 5,000 power. If you give one of those 5k to the rearguard boosting Soul Saver Dragon as the Vanguard, then that Soul Saver Dragon will be swinging in for 25,000. If your opponent is on grade 2, 9,000 power, they'll need a total of 17,000 power just to stop the attack. But there are also triggers that can be checked, giving Soul Saver Dragon a power cap of 35,000 this turn if 2 triggers are checked. You need a minimum of 3 cards with 10,000 shield each to ensure that this attack is guarded. But then your opponent has to deal with the other 2 cards you gave power to from Soul Saver's effect. Those units could be swinging in typically for 21 to 23,000. Even if your opponent is on a Vanguard that has 11,000 power, you need a minimum of 6 cards to guard this turn, without triggers or other unit effects coming into play, making the attacks higher or making the guarding more difficult. This example here illustrates just how strong Soul Saver Dragon was, because for most other decks, the Vanguard could probably only swing in for maximum about 26,000 if they check 2 triggers that turn. Whereas Soul Saver Dragon hit this power without even checking triggers to begin with, and also powered up its other rear guards that can hit in for pretty impressive numbers as well. This massive power output and the ease that it could do it with made Soul Saver Dragon the strongest deck of this time. You know, I haven't mentioned it at all as part of the game plan in this video. Barkle was actually the card that was put on the ban list that I mentioned earlier. Barkle was announced to be the first card to be put on the first ever ban list for Cardfight Vanguard in the English format on July 10th, 2012, and it would come into effect later on August 1st of that year. Since August 1st is out of the scope of the time frame that this video is discussing, we'll talk about this ban list as it draws near in the future. But as you can see, this already illustrates that Cardfight Vanguard is no stranger to power creep. It just shows it in different ways, increasing the number of attacks players can do per turn, or just increasing the power output that cards can gain in a turn, not specifically what's written on the physical card. But we can go over this power creep and the ban list when it comes in the future. For now, let's take a look at the specifics of the decks that were played during this time, including Soul Saver Dragon. Unfortunately, similar to the last video, a lot of the decks during the specific time period in the English format are not well documented. So as I talk about deck lists, just keep in mind that this is using my best approximation based on whatever information I could gather, or whatever patterns I found from deck lists a few sets ahead. However, this will probably be the last video where I need to make these kind of judgments calls, because we'll actually be able to use some data from the champions list in a few sets. But first, let's talk about Oracle Think Tank. As I mentioned before, Oracle Think Tank received a big boost thanks to the newly released Silent Tom, which would be a big part of Oracle Think Tank decks for many sets to come. This set also introduced Psychic Bird to Oracle Think Tank, or OTT for short. Psychic Bird was an additional critical trigger the deck could play, and also had the ability to put itself into soul to allow the player to draw a card. This gave you extra soul and a new card. Psychic Bird could be used to fuel your CEO Amaterasu's Mega Blast for later on, or you can use this soul immediately for your Luck Bird. Luck Bird is another card from this set that allowed the player to Soul Blast 2 to draw 1. This strategy of emptying out the soul worked well with new grade 3 triple rare OTT received called Scarlet Witch Coco. Coco allowed you to Counterblast 2 to draw up to 2 cards and gain power if your soul had no cards. This second part will actually get expanded into its own deck type in the future, but more on that later. Here's what a typical OTT list around this time might have looked like. It is possible that the new stand trigger from the set could have seen some play in some build, as it allowed Silent Tom to be threatening with a guard restrict twice per turn. The main game plan for OTT was a bit different this set thanks to Silent Tom. In addition to drawing cards and using your CEO Amaterasu's skill to try and stack your triggers, the deck can now use this stacking to power up their Silent Tom and push for game. CEO Amaterasu's skill allowed players to look at the top card of their deck at the start of the main phase and choose to keep it on top of the deck or put it on bottom of the deck. This was used to either keep your triggers on top, and you can go into that turn knowing that you would check them. However, it could also mean if you did not shuffle your deck, you could stack multiple triggers on the bottom of your deck. Using all the draw power that OTT had access to, you could arrange a bottom stack of triggers, draw through the top stack of cards till you hit this bottom stack to close out the game. This strategy will be pivotal to OTT and will be the focus of their more iconic unit in the near future. For now, players could do this to go for a kill turn with their Silent Tom once they finally reach that trigger stack. Noah Grapplers, unfortunately, were somewhat the losers of this set. While they finally received their PGs and a new grade 3 in line heat, which could in theory extend their plays, that was about it. A typical list ran 8 stands for crit, as well as 4 heals, or 8 stand with 4 draws. Some players played more crits instead as they found value in the early game pressure the crits could add. The typical Nova Grappler list might have looked something like this, and remained relatively unchanged from set 1 in terms of the main playstyle. The deck was aggressive, achieving multiple attacks in one turn by using stand triggers, and Ashura Kaiser to restand their units when it checked a grade 3 Nova Grappler. The new grade 3 Line Heat worked as a backup to Ashura Kaiser as it could also restand rear guards, but it had a cost of Counterblast 2, and it required the attack to hit. It served a bigger purpose of giving Ashura Kaiser more grade 3s in the deck to possibly drive check in order to trigger its ability. I neglected to mention in the last videos that players would often play cards from other clans in their Nova Grappler decks. Nova Grappler as a clan was centered around restanding units, but early on it also had access to several different ways to counter charge or unflip a card in the damage zone so it was facing upwards, allowing you to counterblast with it again. This included using cards like Karma Queen from set 1, who had a high cost of Counterblast 2, but could run in one of your opponent's units unable to stand the following turn. The best deck in this format was Soul Saver Dragon, as we discussed earlier. Best deck in format is commonly abbreviated as BDIF. I was able to find a list from one of the winners in Japan for this format, Murakami Kazuya. I try not to peek at the Japanese side of the game too much, as I'm trying to specifically cover the English format as accurately as I can, but there's often a lot of overlap between the formats. Here's the list. The list basically has all the cards we talked about: Lu, Barkle, Pongol, and Soul Saver Dragon. You can even see the new War Paladin Special Intercept Gordon as well. High Breeder Akane was a new card from this set, which added even more consistency to the deck. By paying Counterblast 2, you could call any Royal Paladin card from your deck whose race was High Beast. Pongo was the main target, as you could easily use it to put it into Soul to then get your Soul Saver Dragon from the deck. Margul was a new draw trigger from this set that put itself into Soul to give one of your Royal Paladin units 3000 power. While the attack point gain could make a difference, it was mainly played to fill up your Soul. Due to Pongo, and by exception Akane, giving you easy access to Soul Saver Dragon, and it being your finisher, you really only need to play 2 copies of it. One copy of Onslaught was played to ensure you saw your grade 2 ride with a Blaster Blade and the Lu Superior ride. I actually had to change Kazuya's list a bit as he played 3 heal triggers in a promo that were not available during the scope of this video. Yeah, that's right. Promos were a thing this early in the game, but we'll talk about those more in the future once they reach the English format. As you can see from the full list here, this was the true power of Soul Saver Dragon. The deck was easily able to search its game-ending piece, fill up the soul for its cost, as well as guarantee a grade 2 ride with the Lu Superior ride, as well as a guaranteed grade 3 ride if necessary thanks to Pongo being able to search out a grade 3 early on. Going for Soul Saver Dragon's skill to Soul Blast 5 a second time in a game was not out of the realm of possibility, because the first cost of Soul Blast 5 was nearly free after you add up the Pongol, the Lu, the Barkle, and the Flogol that were put into your soul for cards that were placed in the soul early on due to those skills. Before I move on to the rest of the new decks from this set, there is one deck I failed to cover last time. It's actually the main inspiration for this entire video series, to be honest. But I couldn't really find when people actually started playing the deck, so I didn't cover it in the last video. I'm of course talking about the infamous Mr. Overlord, or sometimes even called Invincible Overlord, a deck that is basically the epitome of early Vanguard, as it was the combination of Nova Grappler and Kagero cards, sometimes even other cards in addition. Here's a sample list using just the set 1 cards. As you can see, there are no PGs included in this list. The main goal of the deck is to just use the powerful ability of Overlord to restand and attack multiple times, and support it with Nova Grappler's ability to easily counter charge and refund its high cost. The deck is named Mr. Overlord after the 2 main cards in the deck: Mr. Invincible, the Mega Blast card for Nova Grappler, and Jargonic Overlord from Kagero. Mr. Invincible could countercharge and soul charge 1 card each at the beginning of the turn, as well as giving you a Mega Blast ability to restand all of your units, including itself, as well as the Vanguard. This is because you can also use this Mega Blast ability on the rearguard circle as well. On top of that, since you mainly played Nova Grappler and Cowgirl units, you could use a combination of their triggers. While Nova Grappler only had 1 critical trigger, Cowgirl had 2 different critical triggers in set 1. This meant you can play a max copy of 4 each and have a total of 12 critical triggers in your deck. This was actually increased to 16 critical triggers if you decide to not play any heals, thanks to set 2, because it gave Nova Grappler a new critical trigger. And Nova Grapplers got Red Lightning, a critical trigger that could also counter charge. Some of you might be playing Overdress right now or Standard and be used to the 8 critical triggers being the max that you can play in a deck. No such rule existed during this time and does not exist in the premium format to this day. Back then, you were only limited to what triggers your clan had printed so far and the old trigger rule. This rule stated that you needed to have a unit on board of the same clan as the trigger being checked in order to get the trigger effect. This deck fell in and out of favor as time passed, being the biggest meme deck to being the strongest deck, depending on who you ask. This deck would see different iterations as new decks are released, such as again taking in Mega Colony cards to use their stun effects, or Noob Atomic cards to force the opponent to discard, but still using Nova Grappler's counter charge to support. It was also insanely budget friendly, using many low rarity cards as well as taking advantage of the Kagero trial deck, which contained Overlord. Mr. Overlord might be a deck that we talk about more throughout this series until the clan restriction becomes active in the future. Spike Brothers was a clan that some players tried to make work in set 1 and were heavily rewarded come set 2. Spike Brothers, or commonly just called Spikes, got fleshed out, receiving its own set of triggers, minus a stand trigger, and a new usable grade 3 in General Siegfried. This wave of support also laid the basis for what Spike Brothers' playstyle would be for many sets to come, a highly aggressive all-in playstyle. Here's a sample list. The main goal was to ride your General Siegfried, who could call out a grade 3 Spike Brothers revealed in your drive check to an open rearguard circle. This meant that you could extend and get additional attacks, but also needed to make sure that you could clear up your rearguard circles in the front row to do so. This was done thanks to the cornerstones of Spike Brothers from set 1, High Speed Bracky and Juggernaut Maximum. Maximum was also the prime grade 3 target to call from Siegfried's skill. In addition to Siegfried, the deck could also extend through Dudley Dan. Dan was a very weak rearguard with 4,000 power, but had an effect that could let you call any Spike Brothers card from your deck mid-battle, at the cost of Counterblast 2 and putting a card from your hand into Soul. Putting the card into Soul from hand wasn't as detrimental as it may seem, as the deck needed a lot of Soul for High Speed Bracky and Juggernaut Maximum skills. These both had a skill that let them gain 5,000 power at the cost of Soul Blast 1. But also, at the end of the battle that they attacked, whether or not the attack hit, they would go to the bottom of the deck, thus freeing up the rearguard circle they were occupying. While Spike Brothers also finally received their own PG this set, they often did not plan at max copies in favor of being more aggressive. These upgrades from this set allowed Spikes to see a lot of play throughout this time. The other deck with a huge glow up this set was Grand Blue. While Grand Blue might not have been as powerful as Spikes coming out from set 2, it did receive the bigger boost from this set as its initial wave didn't really have much to offer. That being said, the deck was still not in the strongest spot. They received a set of triggers, except for draw triggers. Grand Blue is a deck that focuses on filling up the drop zone with units and calling units from the drop to field. This often causes the deck to be susceptible to decking out. The second you run out of cards in your deck, you lose the game. The main issue with Grand Blue this set is that they didn't really have a solid game plan, similar to OTT in set 1. Here's a sample list. They received a couple of interesting tools like the Spirit Exceed, which is a card you can superior ride from drop, as well as cards like Samurai Spirit or Captain Night Mist that can call themselves out from drop. However, they required you to give up a rearguard on field, so you weren't actually gaining too much in the exchange. In addition, to call these units you need a Counterblast 1, which meant you really couldn't use the skill of the deck's other grade 3 Baskerk, as this was the clan's Mega Blaster. Spirit Exceed, on the other hand, had no other skill other than being able to superior ride from drop, so the deck was all gimmick and no bite for the time being. The final deck we'll go over today is actually the one featured on the cover art, Kagro, with Blazing Flare Dragon. As I mentioned, Blazing Flare was a new superior ride for the deck, and made use of the soul similar to Soul Saver Dragon. While it wasn't as explosive as World Paladin, it still could compete with Soul Saver to some extent, given the support it received. But also, Kagro had some tools to retire rear guards, which at best meant disrupting the Soul Saver player from completing their plays, and at worst required them to play more cards from hand. Here's a sample list. Kagro is one of the decks that had the most player expression at this time, as there were so many different ways to build the deck. The sample list here is a bit of a mishmash of all those different options. Some decks made full use of both the clan's superior rides, while some decided to stick to only one or none. All of them used Overlord as it was the best card in the clan. In general, Kagro continued the same playstyle from set 1, where they would chip away at their opponent's resources and then swing in with their big Vanguard. And to chip away at your opponent's resources, this set gave Kagro the Gatling Claw Dragon. This was a draw trigger that was actually part of the superior ride for Blazing Flare Dragon. However, it was probably deemed more powerful and saw more play than actually Blazing Flare Dragon did. This is because it had the skill as a draw trigger to Counterblast 1 and put itself into Soul, to choose one of your opponent's grade 0 rear guards and retire it. What does this mean? Well, all of the forerunners that your opponent pulls out when they ride their grade 1 can now get sniped. The Barkle that your Soul Saver Dragon opponent is now placing on the back row, gone. They can no longer use its skill to call out cards. In general, a lot of powerful skills were tied to the starting Vanguards, and if you don't have that starting Vanguard because of the Gatling Claw Dragon, sometimes you often didn't even want to give the Kagro player a single Counterblast in fear of the Gatling Claw Dragon completely shutting down your entire play. Overall, Onslaught of Dragon Souls was a pretty solid set, as it brought in the types of decks that could be played in this early stage of Vanguard. However, it of course did have a huge outlier in the Soul Saver Dragon, which I believe remained as a very powerful tool even after the restriction list. Bushiroad after this set, in what seems to be an effort to make the English format closer in release schedule to the Japanese format, and what I believe might have also been an attempt to introduce stronger decks that were near the power level of such things as Soul Saver Dragon on the English side without them having to wait too long, decided to take the 6th Cardfight Vanguard set released in Japan and actually make it the 3rd Cardfight Vanguard set released in English. Things are going to get a little bit wacky from here on out, so stay tuned for the next video.